Retcons, a neologian, a neologism combining the two words retroactive and continuity, meaning something that changes the fabric of reality after the fact. Often used to describe the effects of a new writer continuing a story by a previous writer, changing what had been into what the new writer wanted or needed it to be to tell the new story. Retcons are hotly debated as one of the most common, if not most popular, activities in nerd conversations. The Terminator films have been an experiment in retcons from the second filmed entry, though I recently discovered that even before Terminator 2, there were comic books which continued the world of the Terminator. The first film appears to create a closed loop. John Connor sends back his father, Kyle Reese, to close the loop that creates his circumstances of conception with his mother, Sarah Connor. The future war has to happen. The second film argues that no fate means that you can prevent Judgment Day and the future war completely, leaving the question of how John Connor exists now that he cannot send his father back in time open. Each future film and most of the novels and comics have also added further retcons. Today's episode, Queen's Gambit, introduces one of the biggest ongoing retcons to the world of the Sarah Connor Chronicles, the character of Derek Reese. In no other media that I'm aware of does Kyle Reese have a brother. But despite that fact, I think the execution of Derek is so well done, both in writing and acting, that I think it falls into what we'd call a good retcon. He brings up so many positive opportunities to explore the themes and emotions that make the Terminator series so rich and long lasting. Themes of sacrifice, love, change, consequences, ends and means, and family. I often even think that whenever I'm looking at the future, where's Derek? Forgetting that he only exists in the world of the Sarah Connor Chronicles. Derek Reese may be a retcon, but he's one of the reasons the Sarah Connor Chronicles is as good as it is. And today, we get to talk about his genesis. I'm Ian.
And I'm Calvin.
Come with us if you want to live.
Brian Austin Green.
Brian Austin Green, formerly married to Megan Fox, who was actually his wife at the time, and some of the writers talk about how she came to set, especially when he had scenes where he was making out with other characters.
Yes. I think I read somewhere that she married him because she thought he was funny. Which seems like the sort of reason that Megan Fox would marry somebody, based on my limited knowledge of Megan Fox.
I don't know anything about Brian Austin Green in person, but he definitely is a good actor.
Yeah. I guess
had not seen him in anything before I saw Sarah Connor Chronicles. Had you watched Beverly Hills or any of his other stuff?
No, I was not a watcher of Beverly Hills 90210. I'm trying to think if I had seen Brian Austin Green in anything else before Sarah Connor Chronicles.
Yeah, I don't. He definitely hadn't registered. I mean, this came out when I was in college, so I had watched some TV, but basically only Buffy, Angel, and Firefly. And I don't think he was on any of those shows. I think because wasn't 90210 around the same time as Buffy? Or I actually don't know anything about 90210.
I'm looking at his curriculum vitae right now. It's possible that I would have seen him. Apparently, he was a guest star on Growing Pains, Parker Lewis Can't Lose, and Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Those were shows that I was allowed to watch, so, or at least my parents didn't know that I was watching. So I would have seen those.
I saw none of those, so I definitely didn't see him in those.
It's possible. It looks like he was also in a guest starred on an episode of CSI. It's possible that I could have seen him on CSI. I don't remember any of these guest star appearances specifically, so it's hard to say. But
What do you think he brings to the character of Derek Reese as an actor?
um, well, so we were talking earlier. I think the sort of the defining, when in the when he's first introduced, we see him sort of running from the scene of Andy Good's uh murder. We assume that he's the one who has killed Andy Good. Um and he's wearing the trench coat. He's kind of, the iconography is kind of associating him with Kyle Reese from the first movie. But then when he's arrested and we see the scenes with him and Ellison, uh it's very different from what we're presented with in the first movie, where Michael Biehn playing Kyle Reese is just sort of like, seems like a crazy person. He's, screaming and yelling and telling everybody about the robots from the future that are going to destroy us all. And in contrast, Derek is sort of a very quiet character who seems to embody maybe some of the strategic thinking and sort of poker face like mannerisms that are extolled in the beginning when Sarah is talking about John learning to play chess in the jungles of Central America. I don't know. What do you think?
I think he has a great physicality. He projects strength. He's much bigger, and that's partly
He does.
because
He seems more well fed than Michael Biehn did in the first movie.
well, he has been back in the past for several months, so he could have gotten a lot of food. But even then, he's quite tall and very broad,
Yes.
especially in contrast to Lena Headey and Summer Glau and Thomas Dekker, who was, I think he was an adult at the time. I think he was over 18, but he was cast so he could play a teenager. So they cast a smaller and more slender man to do that. I also think that he has an intensity. You talk about how he's not a chatterbox and he doesn't go on these wild rants like Michael Bean does, but he has that intensity, which I think is really good. He does project the sense of someone who could be someone who fights killer robots. Like, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy to me who sits back and puts his feet up, which sometimes can be a problem when they cast an actor who's supposed to be a deadly freedom fighter from the future. Speaking here of Terminator Dark Fate, um,
Which I have not seen. We'll get to it eventually.
we will
Uh,
get to it. And
uh,
I actually think there are good things about it. So I'm not wholly slagging off, but I think that one of the characters was miscast and underwritten.
maybe for our presumably small audience that watches or listens to these, maybe this will cast into doubt my credibility as a reviewer and critic of the Terminator franchise, but I have actually never seen Salvation, Genesis, or Dark Fate. So
Most people will say that
I have
you
only
haven't seen much.
seen the Sarah Connor Chronicles and the first three movies.
I actually think that all Terminator movies have something worthwhile to watch about them. Um, but they definitely also have weaknesses.
Yeah, so okay, so let's get into kind of the plot a little bit.
Yeah, we open with that scene of Sarah in the jungle teaching with John learning chess. I think that's really the chess thing. This episode is called Queen's Gambit, of course, but
Yeah.
chess is a big metaphor for the way that John fights Skynet. So, of course, this is supposed to be the genesis of the way he thinks, so that he can outthink Skynet.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea because chess is a very each I'm going to get into my theory of sort of war games in the history of games. Um, many games sort of represent many games that represent war or the concept of war reflect a style of strategy and tactic that was prevalent in the culture that developed that game. So backgammon, arguably one of the oldest uh, games, sort of represents a kind of the kind of warfare that you might see in sort of the Old Testament book of Judges or other depictions of sort of small band parties fighting in skirmishes while fleeing from one location to another through hills and mountains. Um, uh, checkers seems to be, or draughts, if you're from Great Britain, seems to be a representation of a sort of a phalanx style combat where you have a wall of soldiers confronting each other, and you have to have soldiers behind you pushing you forward and uh, shield locking together in order to make a successful advance. And then chess, which I think originally developed in India and in Arabia, but sort of the version that we play kind of took on its full flavor and trappings in medieval Europe, has this idea that it's not just representing a battlefield, but it's representing a kind of society with different ranks and levels of people who each play their individual part, which represents the hierarchy of European medieval civilization, but also I think represents to a certain degree a Christian understanding of individuality, that not all the pieces do the same thing because they're all individuals. Um,
Well, you do have
or at least that's
doubles.
my interpretation of chess.
You do have
Um,
doubles of things, and you have 8 pawns. So I think that there's a lot of sociological meaning and moral meaning and philosophical meaning that we can attach to chess.
but it's interesting because chess is a very linear game. You most of the pieces, the most common piece, the pawn can only advance in one direction. They can't advance back. They can't retreat, go backwards. Um, you're constantly trying to get to the king's file in order to checkmate the king. Um, the game that seems to be playing out in Terminator, the Terminator franchise, especially in the Terminator Sarah Connor Chronicles, is a very different sort of game. Like you said in your monologue, it's a game in which events that you remember having taken place can have been altered through time travel in some way. And I don't know that there's really any game that we commonly play. Certainly no traditional tabletop game that represents that kind of action, except perhaps certain kinds of card games, maybe, where you can rearrange tricks of cards, maybe. I don't know. That's an interesting. But anyway, there's in the episode that we're watching, to return back to that, there's a bit of dialogue between Sarah and Andy Good, who has built a new Turk because the previous one was burnt up in a fire, which we assumed was set by a resistance fighter who we now think is Derek Reese.
I thought Sarah set the fire.
Sarah set the fire?
I'm pretty sure that was the implication of her watching him, because she thought that destroying the Turk was the
Oh, that's
only
right.
way
Because
to.
Derek says you burnt that poor boy's house down.
Well, Cameron was going to kill Andy and is going to kill him again.
Yes.
So she
Yeah,
wanted
so
to save
that's
Andy's
kind of the
life.
tension of the first half of this episode, is whether Cameron's going to kill him or not. And we have this sort of tense sequence of watching Andy and his Turk play against an unnamed Japanese opponent. But yeah, Andy has this bit of dialogue where he says, I built a new Turk, and he kind of harkens back to a conversation that he had before where he says, where he was talking about how the Turk had a personality, and so the old personality of the Turk was sort of that of a moody teenager, and this one seems more like a precocious child. And then he also says, we're at the point now where, actually, I think it's John who says this. We're at the point now where computers playing chess no longer play against humans, but they play against other computers, which is perhaps foreshadowing later plot developments in the series.
Yeah, I think in my view of how the writers approached the war between John and Skynet, they didn't view time travel as going back per se, but to some extent creating new timelines, creating new boards. So it's playing chess on multiple boards. So I think, and you can argue that that's not a realistic way to look at time travel, but that's the sense I get from the way the writers were thinking.
Well, it's similar to, I think this is kind of entered into pop culture and even is referenced sometimes in conversations about politics. In Star Trek, obviously they played three-dimensional chess, which was meant to represent. In Star Trek, three-dimensional chess is a chessboard where there's actually two chessboards with one above the other, and this is meant to sort of sharpen the mind towards being able to think strategically in a space combat environment.
Can pieces move between the two chessboards?
Yes.
Okay,
And
that
this
makes
is
more sense.
and this is is an important plot point in the best Star Trek film, which is Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, in which Khan, who is a super soldier from the 21st century, is apparently unfamiliar with this style of chess.
So we move between the Andy Good and Sarah plot to the John and Cameron at school plot. And this plot, as we've discussed a little bit, and if you know the series, is a bit truncated. There was a lot of stuff they shot that they meant to wrap up in the last half of the season, but of course the writer's strike meant that none of that happened, and they abandoned the plot and pretty much the school completely in the second season. But the school plot in this episode sets up the theme of grief, which you would argue, and I think there's some merit to it, that grief is attempting to be the unifying theme of the episode.
Yeah, so what do you think that this episode is trying to say about grief? Because we have a couple of different things. We have three sort of main lines of dealing with. You have the school situation. I think that also, so John clearly feels regret over not having been able to save Jordan, the student that committed suicide. Then I think that kind of feeds into this sort of subcurrent. We get a couple of hints throughout the episode that Cameron, in her own way, is contemplating what it means for a Terminator to have a sense of mortality. Maybe not necessarily the emotion of grief, but a sense of mortality in some way. So you have the brief scene at the chess match where Cameron is in the hall with the other robots, and one of the robots waves its hand at her in a seemingly friendly gesture, and then she realizes it's because the robot is identifying her as a human that is within its visual range, and it's been programmed to wave its hands at humans. But clearly she's not a human. She's a robot in the same way that he is. And then there's long discussions between her and John about how humans process grief. We have the scene with her and the guidance counselor in which she is not displaying the appropriate emotions of a teenager who witnessed another teenager committing suicide, which,
Although she does mimic that same teenager's grief and anger right before. So it's
yes,
very disturbing.
Yeah, it is. It's a very disturbing scene. There's an element of that scene. I mean, we're a spoiler podcast, so I guess it seems like where the writers were going with that is that the guidance counselor was involved in an affair with the student that committed suicide.
I mean, it's not really a spoiler because we never find that out. This is our speculation.
It's our speculation, but then that kind of gets axed because of what you just said with the writer's strike.
And it was not a very interesting subplot, in my opinion.
So, yeah. So there's clearly mixed motivations on the guidance counselor part.
Trying to cover his butt so no one knows.
But even that, I think, illustrates Cameron's line of thinking in her coming to a realization, perhaps, that if she hasn't done so already, that humans do not always say what they mean. That unlike her and Cromartie, who we also get a scene with Charlie Dixon, between Cromartie and Charlie Dixon, in which it's a role reversal where Cromartie is asking Charlie Dixon questions, posing as an FBI agent. So it's a role reversal to the scene with the guidance counselor and Cameron, but Cromartie is not expressing appropriate emotions to the subject that he's discussing with Charlie Dixon.
And it's very funny because Cromartie doesn't seem to care if people realize he's a robot, because he says, "Call me at this number. I never sleep," which is something
Yeah.
Cameron also says, but she only says that to people who know she's a Terminator.
Yeah, so both of them are incapable of expressing emotions in a human way. Um, but and but also both of them are having in both of those scenes, which parallel each other, both of them are having to deal with the human capacity for deception, which is frustrating to them, literally frustrating in Cromartie's sense, because Charlie lies to him. Um, and baffling to Cameron, although she doesn't seem to particularly care that the guidance counselor is lying to her.
I'm curious what you think about the scene that follows with Charlie and his wife Michelle. To me, you mentioned that you felt that this episode seems narratively unfocused, and I'm not sure I gathered that that's not necessarily my reaction to the episode, but I did think some of the scenes were very weak. The dialogue was weak, and the scene between Charlie and Michelle especially seemed weak. The dialogue felt unnatural. Possibly it was actors and directors not being able to get it to a place where I believed it, but I didn't like the scene. It didn't make me like or dislike the characters. It made me feel awkward and it felt artificial.
Well, I think this is the first scene that we've met Charlie Dixon's wife.
I think it's the first time she's had lines. I think she may have showed
Michelle,
up.
yeah. And I think they're trying to give us a sense of what that marriage looks like. She clearly knows or is privy to the information that Charlie thinks that Sarah is still alive, but she doesn't seem to know more than that. And so it's meant to be shocking to her that John actually came to the house in a previous episode. I agree that the sort of the conclusion of that scene doesn't quite work because she reacts in anger to that revelation and sort of stomps off in a way that doesn't seem quite convincing. But again, we don't know that much about that character because it's the first scene where she's fully introduced. So
Yeah, and I think that they're trying. I think the writer is definitely trying to give us a sense of who she is in a very efficient way. I just don't think that this particular scene pulled it off. I think there was ambition, but it didn't quite execute.
I mean, I've said this before. You know, Dean Winters often plays comedic characters. I think he actually does quite a very good job in a dramatic role as Charlie Dixon in this series. I don't think that whatever I think it's the writing. Because I think the actress is actually doing the best she can with that scene.
Well, and I think that she's quite good as the series progresses. I don't think she's a bad
Yeah,
actress at all. So it really does feel to me like weak writing for her in this scene. And
yeah.
I see the intention of the writing. I just don't think it quite achieved the intention.
I mean, but to go again to sort of return to the theme of grief, part of this episode is Charlie dealing with the emotions surrounding being abandoned by Sarah, and then the revelation that Sarah wasn't the person that he thought she was, and is possibly a terrorist and a murderer.
Well, and there's clearly a sense of they are here because Sarah and John will need a medic very soon.
Yes, and I mean, yes, if you're sort of the meta strategy of the episode uh, is yeah, she doesn't need to kidnap, as John says at the end of the episode. She doesn't need to kidnap some poor doctor. They already have one that they know already, who's been sort of, again, returning to the theme of the normal world and the secret worlds, to use the phrase that spies would use. He's been read in to the covert operation that's going on already.
How much does he know, though?
He knows very little.
Yeah,
But
so he hasn't been fully read in, but
he's at least aware of who Sarah and John are.
he already has a foot in the secret world. He's not a
Yes.
complete stranger. We will see what happens when a complete stranger gets, well, several times when complete strangers get dragged into the secret world. It usually does not end well for them.
It does not end well for them. No. Meanwhile, Ellison is continues to be baffled in his investigation.
Well, after the murder of Andy, so let's backtrack a little bit. Andy and the Turk lose the chess game, which means that the military contract goes to the Japanese, which theoretically means the Turk is not Skynet, or at least is not Skynet at this point. And so Cameron isn't interested in killing him anymore. But when Sarah goes to find
she
Andy,
seems to be like, she would be okay with killing him just to double check, just to be double sure. But
Cameron views herself
John
as a
and,
queen, and
John and
everyone
Sarah
else is a pawn.
deny her that.
But then when Sarah goes to see Andy, she finds him shot through the head and dead, and a man runs away. She chases him, manages to sneak through a shortcut, and beats him up. I'm not sure how convincingly, given just how small Lena Headey is and how big Brian Austin Green is, but it's a fun fight. And then this mystery character.
It's the Worf effect. He's huge to show how tough she is.
I mean, they do this a lot in the show, and it is perhaps one of the things I find slightly less convincing.
I mean, she's not entirely waifish. We get several scenes of her doing pull-ups out in the backyard.
Tiny, though.
Okay.
I would fully believe if Brian Austin Green just picked her up and threw her on the ground. However, he is beaten by her, partly because of surprise in the episode. And Ellison and the police pick him up, and he is interrogated by Ellison, who seems to know that he's connected to the deaths of his compatriots from the previous episode who were murdered by the Terminator.
Yes, we get a helpful scene where Ellison circles a picture of Derek Reese's barcode tattoo, with a red marker, so that we know that that's important.
And Cameron says that is a Skynet work.
I did laugh when I saw that shot, because I was like,
execs said this was important, didn't they?
Well, just like within the world of the show, like, if he was going to circle that with a red marker, why did he not do that when he first recognized what it was? Why did he wait to just before interrogating him to do that? Yeah.
Sarah demonstrates some intrepidity in disguising herself as a sexy lawyer, and
yes, I also laughed when I saw that costume. I was like, does she have like a closet full of costumes of various like aliases that she would have to pose as? Like, where did she get that outfit? Because she never wears anything like that in any other situation.
I imagine somewhere in Los Angeles, a lawyer is sitting in her underwear.
She's been tied up and shoved into a closet. Some poor lawyer somewhere. Of roughly the same size.
And this first scene between Sarah and Derek is fascinating. because both of them are aware they can't say too much, but they do reveal some very significant things. Perhaps the most important one is that this strange man is Derek Reese, brother of Kyle Reese, father of John Connor.
Yes.
When you first watched this scene, were you blown away? Did this blow your mind?
So you're wanting me to take myself back in the Wayback Machine to
I want you to find a bubble tech and go back to young Calvin.
what was my initial reaction to watching this on television back in 2000 was it 2008? When was this released?
I think it was released late 2007.
2007. Okay. Um I think I think my reaction was to admire the cleverness of reintroducing a Reese relative. It was like, oh, that's a good move on the part of the writers of this series. And I think, we'll get into this in future episodes. I mean, it's an important relationship for John, and it provides a certain kind of balance to the show because up until this point, Sarah is the only voice in John's head. She's the one telling him what to do, and in previous episodes, he's gone against her as sort of an act of teenage rebellion. But with the introduction of Derek Reese, what we'll see in future episodes is two competing ideas of how to fight this war.
And you can also start splitting the team in ways that don't seem as foolish. Like whenever you put John by himself, that just seems like a bad idea. And of course, you could leave Cameron by herself. She's definitely someone who could fight her own battles, but since she's a Terminator without any real conscience that we can tell, that also seems like a bad idea. So now that we are going to have four main cast members in this group, you can have, Sarah and John, or Sarah and Cameron, and Sarah and Derek, and then Derek and John, Derek and Cameron. You get to see all these different permutations of the group, and it feels more natural, and I think leads to better storytelling ability than if you just have three and then you have to split it so one's by themselves.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, we'll probably talk about this when we discuss the movies Salvation and Genesis and Dark Fate. Derek's claim is that he was sent back to provide this version of Sarah and John with resources that they needed. Which makes an interesting question. We were talking about chess before. We only get to see the pieces move. We don't necessarily get to see the players.
Yeah.
We get to see one of the players in season 2. But we don't get scenes of future John. And so we don't have, like, is it like in some science fiction movies where you have like competing memories within the same sort of consciousness? Like, what does this seem like to John? Are his memories of what's going on getting rewritten as kind of a palimpsest, or does he have an understanding that the board keeps changing every time a new continuity is established.
Well, since we never get to see
I mean,
future
that would have
John,
been. I've never seen Genesis. I get the impression that that is what the movie Genesis is about.
I mean, Genesis has an answer to that question, but that answer is for the Genesis timeline. It doesn't apply to any other Terminator timeline.
It would be interesting if this series had lasted long enough for us to get an answer to that question for the world of this series, which we never
I
did.
agree. I'm not sure that we would have though, given when we finish the series, we'll talk about the pretty extensive documents that showrunner Josh Friedman has provided about what he wanted to do with the rest of the show. And we'll talk about whether that actually could have happened, whether we could have seen John's memories or seen John as a future character or not. So stay tuned.
Right.
In this, one thing, since I criticized the writing before, I think it's only fair that I say I really like the phrase that Derek says to Sarah, "I will not be the asshole who brings metal down on the Connors." It's one of the first really pungent pieces of future slang calling Terminator metal. Um, and I like it. It's textured and it makes sense as a piece of future slang. So I like that part, and that is a consistent piece of slang throughout all the future scenes that we see to come.
Well, and it points to what we'll see, like you said, in the future scenes to come. It points to the difference between Sarah's perspective and Derek's perspective on this war, which is that Sarah only has what Kyle told her and her own imagination as a way of sort of filling in what Skynet is. And as we all know, often your fear plus imagination often creates a distortion of the reality of an actual threat. Whereas Derek has actually fought in the war in the future, and so has a different perspective on Terminators and Skynet. And we see some of that perspective in his reaction to seeing Cameron for the first time.
He clearly knows that she is metal, and he doesn't like it.
He knows that he's metal. He doesn't say this explicitly in any of the scenes in this episode, but he probably has buddies who have been killed by Cameron models. Yeah. Because we presume there is more than one Cameron in the future.
I don't know if we can presume that, but that's definitely a season 2 question. In our last section of this episode, Sarah, Cameron, and John stage a rescue of him as the T888 or T888 attacks. So we also get the terminology of the T888, which most of the Terminators we see seem to be variants of T888 instead of 100, 101s, 800s, 850s, or 1000s.
I
So
admire you so much for looking that up. I wouldn't have bothered doing that, but you
I
did the right thing of looking up on the internet all the different models of Terminators that we've seen so far.
I am the type of fan who likes to know the numbers of Terminators.
You're also the guy who is like studying the different models of blasters in the Star Wars franchise when you were a child. Whereas I
cannot lie.
I was just like, yeah, they're blasters, whatever.
I'm telling you, the DC-17 is way better than the DC-15.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. Yeah. For sure. I think you know what it is. You like guns better than I do. Like I really could care less about guns, but you're kind of a gun guy. Um,
I'm a
I was more interested in studying the schematics of various spaceships when I was a child.
yeah. Um, we have a really interesting piece of lore added to the show. Just like I said that metal is a piece of slang that we see used from this episode onwards to refer to Terminators. We see how to kill a Terminator in a way that is relatively effective and is used
And
in
permanent.
and permanent and but also difficult. So it's not easy. It's not the kind of thing where it's just like if you shoot it 50 times with this gun, it's dead, like in a shooter. You have to incapacitate it so it can't move and hurt you, take off its scalp, take out the chip, and destroy the chip. And you need two specific tools. You need a knife to get it open and a pliers to take it out. So like it sets this piece of action up that you have
Now,
to do.
now, are you at all bothered by the fact that they have incapacitated Terminators before with electric shock? So why is this the first time that Cameron has ever attempted this kind of Terminator destruction?
So my argument would be
So
we
they have
are
120 seconds. If they electrocute a Terminator, they have 120 seconds before it reboots. We know that that was established in the first episode.
right.
In that 120 seconds, why has Cameron never attempted to remove the operating chip?
My argument would be in the first episode, Cameron doesn't have enough time to communicate with John and Sarah to make sure they have the tools ready. She hasn't had the time training with them, so she knows what their reaction times and their willingness to trust her when she says strange things to them. Um, and so the first episode, she if she says, "Give me a knife" or "Give me a screwdriver," why does she think that John and Sarah are going to listen to her and give her those tools? She can't do it by herself. They have to get them. She doesn't know they have those tools.
How does she know that they have those tools now? Because
Well, my guess is that she stocked the toolbox in the truck and she told John where it was. So she has set
hmm,
up more equipment for herself to do this and she's trained the team.
hmm.
And the other thing is the 120 seconds, as we will see later, it is it is not a lot of time. And if you don't do it, you are now right next to an angry Terminator who just woke up.
Yeah, I mean I like the scene. I think the fridge logic of the scene is a little fuzzy.
Why do you say
Um,
that? Because the
just the
incapacitating of a
way that
Terminator.
she's able. I mean, if you're thinking about it in sort of real world combat, you know, it's a reverse from a prone position. You know, he has her face down on the ground and he's wailing against her. Um, and then he's briefly distracted by getting shot multiple times, which allows her to get out of that position. And then she's able to wrap a metal bar around his neck and briefly sort of jigger his system long enough to remove the chip. I'm trying to remember. Does he actually seem to lose consciousness? The light in the eyes goes out when they remove the chip, but what is he doing before that? Because he's not actively resisting when they remove the chip. I know this is a very granular breakdown of the scene.
I'm surprised that
Probably
you didn't.
irrelevant, but you asked.
I'm surprised that you didn't buy this. I personally thought it was a nice setup and payoff for all the pieces we've learned about Terminator chips and what can a person actually do when fighting a Terminator.
I mean, this is by far the most interesting T versus T combat that we've seen in the series. Where they're not just shoving each other through walls. The whole sequence with them in the back of the prisoner transfer van, bumping up against the walls, which is throwing off Sarah's steering. I liked that detail because it demonstrates what often doesn't get demonstrated in other T versus T fights, which is that the Terminators actually have like mass, and when you throw something that heavy against something, it's going to move the thing that you're throwing it against. So if you throw a Terminator against the side of a truck, it's going to move the truck, which makes it harder to steer the truck. So I like that detail. Then you have the whole, she eventually sort of shoves him hard enough that he actually sort of like goes out of rips open the side of the truck. So I mean, it's a well choreographed scene. It's just the end of it seems maybe a little bit implausible, but I don't know.
I don't know, that did not occur to me. I was mostly interested in, aha, this is a puzzle piece to what you can do in a Terminator fight. So it's not just hitting each other and running away.
It is a good rule establishment for one way to destroy a Terminator. Yes.
And I think that this destruction of the Terminator really prompts Cameron to think about her own mortality, to go back to the theme of grief and loss. She said that she read all the letters that people left for Jordan in the school.
She doesn't sleep.
She doesn't sleep. And she does write a letter at the end. I would personally argue she's writing theoretically to Jordan, but also as a way to explore her own fears for her own mortality and whether people will mourn her, what she can do to prevent that. I think that killing a Terminator herself really prompts a lot of reflection on Cameron's part.
I mean, I've already recognized, I've already referenced Star Trek once in this episode, so I might as well go for it again. This is a reoccurring theme in the development of the character of Data in Star Trek: The Next Generation. Is he is incapable of feeling human emotions, at least for most of the series. But he, throughout the series, Data is constantly sort of trying to recreate human experiences and rituals, and explore human culture for himself, in the hope that having shared experiences with his human crewmates will allow him to understand their emotions better. And so I think maybe we get a glimpse of that with Cameron writing the letter at the end of the episode. That even though she may not experience the same kind of emotions as John, if she writes a letter, maybe she can understand what John is thinking and feeling better.
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of our episode. Do you have any concluding overall thoughts about Queen's Gambit?
Why do you think it's called Queen's Gambit? The only one who actually performs a gambit of sorts in this episode is the T-888, because the T-888 punches a police officer in order to get himself arrested so that he can infiltrate the jail where Derek is being held, which is a kind of Gambit. So do you think that's what's being referenced, or do you think they were just like, there's chess playing at the beginning of this episode, we'll call it Queen's Gambit?
Well, the Japanese team wins by performing a Queen's Gambit, by sacrificing the queen to lure the Turk into a trap and defeating it. So I think that's part of it. I think the whole chess theme in general was part of it. I would argue that Derek performs something of a gambit, although we won't truly know what's going on till next episode. And I think you can argue that both Sarah and Cameron are attempting to set up gambits. Cameron in training and protecting John and teaching him how to kill Terminators. Sarah in trying to give John the skills he needs and the emotional toughness he needs, while also trying to keep him human as he can be in terrible circumstances.
Well, we didn't discuss the more human component of that final combat scene, which is that Derek and Sarah are just willing to abandon Cameron to the Terminator, the other Terminator, where the climax of that combat scene is because John is attempting to rescue Cameron. Now you could justify that strategically by saying he's a guerrilla fighter and he doesn't want to abandon an important piece of weaponry and equipment. But it also demonstrates a certain kind of not just humanity, but an emotional attachment to Cameron. And demonstrates a conflict in his way of thinking about Terminators in a way that's different from both Sarah and Derek. Derek doesn't even want to be in the same zone and area as a Terminator. Is extremely uncomfortable with the presence of Cameron. And Sarah has sort of accepted using Cameron as a kind of tool and weapon, but she doesn't feel any need to preserve Cameron in the same way that she felt the need to rescue Derek, despite the extreme risk to herself and John in doing so. And then you have sort of the fumble within that scene where the 888 starts firing at them, and both Derek and Sarah jump in front of John to put themselves between him and bullets. Which again demonstrates the idea we get in this episode. Sarah's justification for why they have to save Derek is he is family. John seems to consider Cameron as family, but Sarah and Derek do not.
Which, of course, will be a huge conflict all the way through season 2.
Yes.
I would say that this episode, because it introduces Derek, I have a lot of enjoyment of it, and I think that it does a good job of introducing Derek. I do think there were some writing weaknesses, as I talked about. I think there's also a lot of writing strengths. In general, I'd say this is a solid episode. It's definitely not an episode that I dislike. That pretty much wraps up the Queen's Gambit. Next time, because we're about to head into an episode talking about the future of war, we're going to take another detour and watch Terminator Salvation, which is a depiction of the one depiction of a possible future war in the Terminator world. A very controversial one, and one that Calvin hasn't seen, so that'll be an exciting experience for him. I have also watched Terminator Zero, which just dropped on Netflix. I'm encouraging Calvin to see it, and I encourage people who enjoy Terminator to see it. It is definitely not my favorite Terminator story. Definitely not as good as Sarah Connor Chronicles, but definitely as worthwhile as several of the films.
We also need to figure out, if we're going to do Salvation, we also need to figure out when we're going to read the Philip K. Dick story and the Ellison story that both of us think were probably inspirations for the Terminator franchise.
We will put those on our list.
All right.
So
that
wraps up this episode. As I said, next time we'll be watching Terminator 4, Salvation, The Future War, Kyle Reese, direct sequel to Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. Until then, I've been Ian.
I'm Calvin.
We'll be back.